Hi, I'm Emma. My mother-in-law signed me up to sing at the community talent show, not to support me, but to watch me crumble in front of everyone she knew. She called it volunteering me for a good cause, told her bridge club I'd probably get stage fright and embarrass myself. But I didn't crumble. I stood there, microphone cutting out, audience snickering, a room full of people waiting for me to fail, and still I found my voice. She thought she was setting me up for public humiliation. She didn't realize she was giving me back something I'd lost 5 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds at the Gi Chen family home in Riverside Heights, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that had seen better decades. I stood at the counter, methodically spreading peanut butter on whole wheat bread for David's lunch, the same routine I'd followed every weekday for the past 3 months since we'd moved in to help his mother recover from hip surgery. The house still smelled faintly of the medicinal ointment Patricia used, mixed with the vanilla candles she burned obsessively to mask it. Patricia sat at the breakfast table in her silk robe, the one with tiny roses that she claimed was vintage, but looked more worn than antique. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she scrolled through her tablet, occasionally making small, disapproving sounds at whatever community gossip she was consuming. David had already left for his shift at Riverside General, kissing my forehead and whispering his usual apology for leaving me alone with his mother. He meant well, but 3 months of playing nursemaid to a woman who treated me like an inconvenient houseguest was wearing me thinner than the dish towels I folded every evening. I sealed David's sandwich in a container, listening to Patricia's fingers tap against her tablet screen with increasing intensity. She had that look on her face, the one that meant she was plotting something she thought was clever. Her dark eyes, so much like David's but lacking any warmth, kept darting toward me and then back to her screen. I'd learned to recognize that expression over the past year of marriage. It usually preceded some criticism disguised as helpful advice, or a story about how David's ex-girlfriend used to do things better. The refrigerator hummed loudly, competing with the sound of Patricia clearing her throat in that deliberate way that meant she wanted my attention. I continued packing David's lunch, adding an apple and the homemade cookies I'd baked the night before, hoping she'd let me finish my morning routine in peace. But Patricia had never been one for peaceful moments, especially when she had something she considered important to discuss. She set down her tablet with more force than necessary, the case making a sharp crack against the wooden table surface. I turned toward her, already bracing myself for whatever announcement was coming. Her smile was too bright, too practiced, the kind she used when she was about to do something she knew I wouldn't appreciate but would frame as being for my own good. "Emma, dear, I've done something wonderful for you." Her voice carried that sing-song, quality she used when talking to children or when she was about to deliver news she expected resistance to. "I have such exciting news. You remember the annual Riverside Heights Community Talent Showcase? The one I've been helping organize for the past 15 years? Well, this year's theme is Hidden Talents, Bright Futures, and I thought it would be perfect for you to participate." I felt my stomach drop somewhere toward my feet. The Riverside Heights Community Talent Showcase was Patricia's domain, her yearly opportunity to showcase her influence in the community while raising money for the local food bank. She'd been talking about it constantly since February, dropping names of participants and detailing the elaborate planning meetings she attended twice weekly at the community center. It was her social Olympics, and she'd never once suggested I should be involved. "Patricia, I don't think that's really my thing." I tried to keep my voice light, hoping to deflect whatever scheme she was hatching. "I'm not much of a performer, and I wouldn't want to take a spot from someone who actually wants to participate. Besides, I'll be happy to help with setup or ticket, sales, or whatever else you need." She waved her hand dismissively, as if my concerns were gnats to be batted away. "Nonsense, dear. Everyone has hidden talents, just like the theme suggests, And I already signed you up for a solo vocal performance. The deadline was yesterday, so I took the liberty of submitting your name. Jessica Wong, the coordinator, was thrilled to have another participant. Apparently, they were short on acts for the second half of the show. The words hit me like cold water. Solo vocal performance. I hadn't sung in public since my mother's funeral 5 years ago, and even then, it had been barely a whisper of amazing grace that broke halfway through the first verse. My mother had been the singer in our family, the one who filled our small apartment with melody while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. When she died from cancer at 53, the music died with her, and I'd packed away everything that reminded me of those songs we used to share. Patricia, I can't do that. The words came out sharper than I intended, but panic was rising in my chest like floodwater. I don't sing. I haven't sung in years. You need to call Jessica and tell her there was a mistake. Patricia's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Oh, but Emma, I already told everyone at Bridge Club yesterday about your performance. Linda Park was so impressed that David married someone with artistic talents, and Mrs. Chen from the dry cleaners asked specifically about what song you'll be singing. I'd hate to disappoint them by saying you've decided not to participate after all. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Patricia had announced my participation to her entire social circle before bothering to inform me, creating a web of expectations and social obligations that would make backing out seem like I was letting down the entire community. It was the kind of manipulation she excelled at, framing her desires as community service and my resistance as selfishness. I can't sing in front of people, Patricia. I tried again, hoping she'd hear the genuine distress in my voice. I have terrible stage fright, and I'll just embarrass myself and disappoint everyone. Surely there's someone else who would love the opportunity. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression she might use to examine a bug under a magnifying glass. You know, Emma, when David was younger, he used to make excuses too, always afraid to try new things, always worried about what other people might think. But I taught him that we don't grow by staying comfortable. Sometimes we need a little push to discover what we're capable of. The comparison stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. I had become someone who avoided challenges, who preferred the safety of routine and predictability. But this wasn't about growth or self-discovery. This was about Patricia asserting control, proving that she could manipulate my life as easily as she rearranged the furniture in her living room. The talent show is in 3 weeks, she continued, picking up her tablet again as if the matter were settled. That gives you plenty of time to prepare. I'm sure you'll find something appropriate to perform. Maybe something contemporary that the younger people in the audience would appreciate. Nothing too challenging, of course. I stood frozen beside the counter, lunch container still in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, Patricia had committed me to public humiliation while making it impossible to refuse without seeming ungrateful and disappointing her friends. It was masterful in its cruelty, wrapped in the language of opportunity and community spirit. The worst part was that she genuinely seemed to believe she was doing me a favor. Her expression held no malice, only the satisfied look of someone who'd solved a problem efficiently. She'd found a way to fill a slot in her precious talent show while forcing her difficult daughter-in-law to participate in community life. 2 birds, 1 stone, and no consideration for the bird that was about to be struck. I'll need to think about this, I managed to say, though we both knew thinking wouldn't change anything. The wheels were already in motion, and Patricia had ensured that stopping them would require a level of social confrontation I wasn't prepared for. Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. She was already scrolling through her tablet again, probably updating her bridge club about the successful recruitment of her daughter-in-law. Just remember that Jessica will need your song choice by Friday for the programs. And Emma, try to choose something that shows off whatever vocal range you have. We want to make a good impression. I walked upstairs to the guest bedroom that David and I had been sharing for 3 months, closing the door behind me with deliberate quiet. The room still felt temporary. Our belongings mixed awkwardly with Patricia's guest room decor and the faint smell of mothballs that seemed permanently embedded in the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding David's lunch, and tried to understand how my morning had derailed so completely. Through the thin walls, I could hear Patricia, on the phone, her voice bright with excitement as she shared news of my upcoming performance with whoever had answered. She was already spinning the narrative, probably describing how thrilled I was to contribute to the community and how she'd encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone. By evening, half of Riverside Heights would know that Emma Chen was singing at the talent showcase, and backing out would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. The guest room had one small window that looked out over Patricia's meticulously maintained garden, where every flower bloomed according to her schedule and every hedge was trimmed to identical perfection. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something suffocating about the precision, the way nothing was allowed to grow wild or unexpected. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching a sparrow land on the bird bath Patricia had positioned for optimal viewing from the kitchen window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Hope Mom isn't driving you too crazy today. Love you. See you tonight." The message was sweet, but it reminded me that he had no idea what his mother had just orchestrated. He'd come home exhausted from his 12-hour shift, and I'd have to explain that I was now committed to singing solo in front of 300 people because his mother had decided it would be good for me. I thought about my mother then, as I always did when music entered my life uninvited. Sarah Martinez had possessed the kind of voice that made people stop their conversations in restaurants when she hummed along to the background music. She'd sung in the church choir until the chemo made her too weak to stand for entire services, and even then, she'd hummed while the nurses checked her vitals, turning medical procedures into impromptu lullabies. After she died, I'd packed away her songbooks and sheet music, along with the small keyboard she'd used to practice hymns and the folk songs she'd learned from her own mother. The music felt too heavy to carry, too sharp with memory to touch, without bleeding. For 5 years, I'd successfully avoided any situation that might require me to sing, declining karaoke invitations and staying silent during birthday songs and Christmas carols. But now Patricia had dragged music back into my life with the same casual authority she used to rearrange my kitchen cabinets or critique my cooking. She'd signed me up to perform without asking, committed me to public vulnerability without considering that some wounds were still too fresh to expose to strangers. The talent showcase wasn't about hidden talents or bright futures. It was about Patricia demonstrating her power to control the people in her son's life, wrapped in the acceptable language of community involvement. I pulled out my phone and searched for Jessica Wong's contact information, thinking I might call and explain that there had been a misunderstanding. But Patricia had been too thorough in her manipulation. By now, Jessica would have updated the program, possibly already begun printing materials, and definitely discussed the lineup with other organizers. Backing out wouldn't just disappoint Patricia. It would create work and inconvenience for people who were volunteering their time for charity. The trap was perfect because it used my own decency against me. Patricia knew I wouldn't want to create problems for the organizers or let down the community, so she'd made it impossible to refuse without seeming selfish. She'd turned my consideration for others into a leash, and she was holding the other end with the satisfied smile of someone who'd played chess while I was still learning checkers. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine standing on the stage at Maplewood Community Center, looking out at an audience full of Patricia's friends and neighbors, all waiting to see what David's quiet wife could do when pushed into the spotlight. The image made my chest tight with anxiety, but underneath the panic was something else, something I hadn't felt in 5 years. It was faint and buried under layers of grief and self-protection, but it was there. It was the memory of my mother's voice teaching me harmony. the ghost of all those songs we'd shared before cancer stole her ability to sing. Maybe Patricia thought she was setting me up for embarrassment, expecting me to stumble through some contemporary pop song or decline to participate and prove that I was as unreliable as she'd always suspected. But she didn't know about the music that lived in my bones, inherited from a woman who could make grocery lists sound like prayers. She didn't know that before I became someone who avoided challenges, I'd been someone who sang with my mother while we cooked Sunday dinner, our voices weaving together like ingredients in a recipe passed down through generations. The talent showcase was still 3 weeks away, which meant I had time to decide whether to let Patricia watch me fail or surprise everyone, including myself, by remembering who I used to be when music was still safe to touch. Either way, I was committed now, caught in the web she'd woven with my own name and her assumptions about my limitations. I stood up from the bed, still holding David's forgotten lunch, and walked to the closet where we'd stored the boxes I hadn't unpacked in 3 months of living in Patricia's house. Somewhere in those boxes was my mother's songbook, wrapped carefully in tissue paper and waiting for the day I might be strong enough to open it again. That day had arrived whether I wanted it or not, delivered by a mother-in-law who thought she knew exactly what would break me. But Patricia had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that pushing me toward music would expose my weakness, not knowing that music had been my strength long before grief taught me to fear it. The talent showcase might have been her idea, but what happened on that stage would be entirely mine to control. The Maplewood Community Center sat at the heart of Riverside Heights, like a tired queen holding court over suburban dreams and weekend soccer games. I'd driven past it countless times during my 3 months of living with Patricia, noting the faded brick exterior and the hand-painted signs advertising everything from senior water aerobics to toddler music classes. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of industrial coffee and floor wax, where folding chairs had been arranged and rearranged for 1,000 different gatherings, each leaving behind invisible layers of human hopes and disappointments. The building had been constructed in the 1970s with the optimistic architecture of that era, all clean lines and large windows that were supposed to represent transparency and community connection. Now, 40-something years later, those same windows needed cleaning, and the clean lines had been softened by decades of California weather and deferred maintenance. But there was something enduring about the place, something that spoke to the persistence of small communities and their determination to create spaces where neighbors could become friends, or at least familiar strangers sharing common causes. Patricia had been volunteering at the community center for nearly 2 decades, long enough to remember when the current director was just a part-time coordinator, and the annual talent showcase was a modest affair held in the smaller multi-purpose room. Over the years, she'd watched it grow into Riverside Heights' signature fundraising event, the kind of evening where local business owners bought tables and families planned their spring social calendars around attendance. She spoke about the talent showcase the way other people discussed national holidays, with a mixture of reverence and proprietary pride that came from years of investment. The event had evolved beyond simple entertainment into a complex social ecosystem where community status was measured in program acknowledgments and seating arrangements. Patricia served on the organizing committee, which meant she spent months coordinating with Jessica Wong, the community center's perpetually overwhelmed events coordinator, discussing everything from sound system requirements to the proper way to display sponsor banners. It was serious business disguised as small-town fun, and Patricia approached it with the strategic thinking of a military campaign planner. This year's theme, Hidden Talents, Bright Futures, had been Patricia's suggestion during a particularly contentious committee meeting in January. She'd argued that the community needed to celebrate untapped potential rather than just showcasing the same local musicians and dance studios that participated every year. The theme was meant to encourage ordinary residents to step forward and reveal abilities they'd kept private, turning the talent showcase into a kind of community-wide coming-out party for dormant creativity. Of course, Patricia's interpretation of hidden talents had very specific parameters. She wasn't interested in genuine surprise or authentic self-expression. She wanted polished presentations that would reflect well on the organizing committee and generate positive social media coverage for the community center. The hidden talents she sought were ones that could be safely revealed without causing embarrassment or challenging anyone's expectations too dramatically. It was revelation within acceptable limits, creativity with training wheels, vulnerability with a safety net. The community center's main auditorium could seat just over 300 people when the folding chairs were arranged in optimal configuration, which Jessica Wong had calculated and recalculated multiple times to ensure maximum fundraising potential. The stage was modest but functional, with basic lighting equipment that had been upgraded 2 years earlier thanks to a donation from Riverside Heights' most successful real estate agent. Behind the curtain, a small backstage area provided minimal space for performers to prepare, usually resulting in a chaotic mixture of nervous energy and costume changes that tested everyone's commitment to community theater. Patricia had described the audience composition to me in exhaustive detail, apparently believing that knowing who would be watching would somehow make the experience less terrifying. The front rows would be filled with committee members and major donors, the people whose opinions mattered most in Patricia's social calculus. Behind them would sit the families of performers, armed with smartphones and the kind of enthusiastic support that made amateur performances bearable. The back section typically housed community members who attended out of civic duty rather than genuine interest, the ones who checked their watches frequently and left during intermission if the performances ran long. Local businesses sponsored the event at various levels, their names printed in different font sizes on programs that doubled as subtle advertisements for everything from dental services to landscaping companies. The program itself was a thick booklet that Patricia and her committee treated like a literary publication, debating font choices and layout decisions with the intensity of magazine editors preparing for newsstands. Each performer received a brief biography and photograph, transforming neighbors into temporary celebrities worthy of program space and public attention. The talent showcase had become Riverside Heights' unofficial annual reunion, the one guaranteed opportunity for longtime residents to catch up on marriages, divorces, job changes, and children's college plans. It was social networking disguised as entertainment, community bonding wrapped in the acceptable package of charitable fundraising. People attended as much to see each other as to watch the performances, turning the evening into a complex social navigation exercise where program placement and applause duration carried meaning beyond simple appreciation. Patricia's role in organizing the event had elevated her status within the community's informal hierarchy, giving her influence that extended far beyond the confines of the community center. She was consulted on everything from vendor selection to conflict resolution when performers had creative differences or scheduling conflicts. Her opinions carried weight because she'd invested years in building relationships with local business owners, municipal officials, and the network of volunteers who made community events possible. The talent showcase was her annual opportunity to demonstrate that influence while contributing to a worthy cause. The rehearsal schedule had been meticulously planned to accommodate everyone from working parents to retirees with medical appointments, with Patricia serving as the unofficial timekeeper, who ensured that each act received appropriate preparation time without disrupting the overall timeline. She'd coordinated with Jessica Wong to create a system of organized chaos that somehow resulted in coherent performances, despite the inevitable last-minute emergencies and creative meltdowns that plagued community theater productions. Sound checks were scheduled for the week before the event, giving the volunteer tech crew time to address any equipment issues and performers a chance to experience the acoustics of the community center's main auditorium. Patricia had explained this process to me with the detailed precision of someone describing surgical procedures, apparently believing that understanding the technical aspects would reduce my anxiety about performing. Instead, her explanations had only emphasized the public nature of what she'd committed me to, the number of people involved in making the event successful, and the many ways things could go wrong despite careful planning. The fundraising aspect, of the talent showcase provided its moral justification, transforming what might otherwise seem like community vanity into charitable service. The proceeds supported the local food bank, which served families throughout Riverside Heights and neighboring communities, making attendance feel like civic responsibility rather than optional entertainment. Patricia frequently reminded people that buying tickets and sponsoring performers directly translated into meals for families facing food insecurity, weaponizing charity to increase participation and guilt people into generous contributions. But beneath the charitable mission and community spirit lay the real purpose of the talent showcase, which was to reinforce the social bonds and hierarchies that kept small communities functioning. It was an annual ritual of belonging and recognition, where longtime residents could demonstrate their continued relevance while newcomers proved their commitment to community integration. Patricia understood this subtext perfectly, which was why she'd signed me up without asking. Participating in the talent showcase wasn't just about performing. It was about publicly claiming membership in Riverside Heights' social fabric. The Heights Community Center's main auditorium felt different when empty, like a theater between performances when the magic had temporarily departed, but the potential for transformation remained. I'd visited it twice since Patricia's announcement. Once, to speak with Jessica Wong about song requirements, and once simply to sit in the back row and try to imagine myself on stage. Both visits had left me unsettled, not because the space was intimidating, but because it felt so ordinary. The stage where I was expected to reveal hidden talents was just a raised platform with standard lighting, no more magical than any other public speaking venue. Yet Patricia and her committee had invested this ordinary space with extraordinary significance, turning a community center auditorium into a theater of dreams and nightmares, where reputations could be made or destroyed in 3-minute performances. They'd created mythology around an annual fundraiser, convincing themselves and others that the talent showcase represented something profound about human potential and community support. The reality was simpler and more complex simultaneously. It was neighbors agreeing to be vulnerable together, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and preparation. The morning I discovered exactly what Patricia had set in motion began like any other weekday in the Chen household, with the deceptive calm that often precedes personal disasters. I was grading third-grade math papers at the kitchen table, red pen in hand, trying to decipher whether Tommy Martinez had meant to write 6 or 9 in his multiplication problems. The coffee had grown cold in my favorite mug, the one with a EI chip on the handle that I'd claimed from my mother's kitchen after she died. Patricia was in the living room, having her daily phone conversation with Linda Park, their voices creating a familiar background hum of gossip and social coordination. I should have recognized the shift in their conversation tone, the way their voices dropped to conspiratorial whispers punctuated by excited giggles. Patricia and Linda had perfected this communication style over decades of friendship, a verbal code that allowed them to share sensitive information while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. But I was focused on Tommy's math problems and the dozen other papers that needed grading before I could start preparing dinner, so I missed the warning signs until it was too late. The doorbell rang at precisely 10:30, interrupting Patricia's phone call and my concentration simultaneously. Through the front window, I could see a woman in her 40s holding what appeared to be official paperwork, her posture suggesting someone on a mission rather than a casual visitor. Patricia ended her call quickly, smoothed her hair, and practically glided to the front door with the enthusiasm of someone expecting good news. "Emma, dear, could you join us in the living room?" Patricia's voice carried that particular sweetness she used when she wanted witnesses to her generosity, or when she was about to reveal something she considered a delightful surprise. I set down my red pen and walked toward the living room, where Patricia was already gesturing for her visitor to take a seat on the floral sofa that dominated the room like a textile garden. "This is Jessica Wong from the community center," Patricia announced with the pride of someone introducing a celebrity. "She's here with some wonderful news about the talent showcase. Jessica, this is my daughter-in-law Emma, the one I told you about. the one with the lovely singing voice that she's been hiding from all of us. Jessica Wong looked exactly like someone who'd spent years managing community events and volunteer personalities. Her smile was professionally warm but slightly tired around the edges, and she carried herself with the efficient energy of someone accustomed to juggling multiple crises, while maintaining diplomatic relationships with strong-willed committee members. She was younger than Patricia, but had clearly learned to navigate the complex social dynamics that surrounded community center politics. "It's so nice to meet you, Emma." Jessica's handshake was firm and brief, the gesture of someone who'd mastered the art of professional friendliness without wasting time on unnecessary pleasantries. "Patricia has told me so much about your musical background, and I have to say, we're thrilled to have you participating in this year's showcase. We've been hoping to attract more diverse voices, especially from the younger generation in our community." The word diverse struck me as oddly chosen, since Patricia had certainly not emphasized my Mexican heritage when discussing my supposed musical talents. I suspected Jessica was referring to age diversity rather than cultural background, but the comment highlighted how Patricia had been marketing my participation to the organizing committee. I was being presented as a representative of younger community members, despite being 28 and hardly the youngest resident of Riverside Heights. Patricia beamed with satisfaction as Jessica continued her presentation. "We've scheduled you for the second half of the program, which is really quite an honor for a first-time participant. Usually, we place newcomers earlier in the evening, but Patricia insisted that your performance would be perfect for building toward our grand finale. The second half is when we have our largest audience, since some people arrive fashionably late after dinner." The implications of this scheduling decision settled over me like cold rain. Patricia hadn't just signed me up to perform. She'd specifically requested premium placement that would maximize the number of people witnessing whatever happened on stage. She'd ensured that my potential humiliation would occur when the audience was largest and most alert, rather than during the early slots when people were still settling in and conversation might mask individual performances. Jessica opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of official-looking paperwork. "Now, we do need some information from you to finalize everything for the program. Could you tell me the title of the song you'll be performing? We like to include that information so audience members can follow along if they're familiar with the piece. Also, will you need any special lighting or sound equipment beyond our standard vocal microphone setup?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't realized was burning. Patricia's eyes were bright with anticipation, as if she genuinely expected me to produce a song title and technical requirements from thin air. Jessica waited with her pen poised over the form, clearly expecting this to be a routine administrative detail rather than the moment when Patricia's scheme would be exposed. I'm still deciding between a few different songs," I managed to say, trying to buy time while my mind raced through the implications of what was happening. "I haven't quite settled on the final choice yet. Could I get back to you with those details in a day or two?" Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the way it probably did whenever community volunteers made her job more complicated than necessary. "Well, we really do need that information by Friday at the latest. The programs go to print early next week, and any changes after that point become quite expensive. I'm sure you understand that we're working with a limited budget, and we want to put as much money as possible toward the food bank, rather than administrative costs." The gentle pressure was expertly applied, wrapping practical concerns in charitable language that made my hesitation seem selfish. Patricia nodded approvingly, as if Jessica had articulated exactly the point she'd been hoping someone would make. Of course, Emma understands the importance of meeting deadlines, especially when it's for such a worthy cause. She's very community-minded, aren't you, dear? Patricia's question was rhetorical, but it demanded a response that would demonstrate my commitment to both the performance and the charitable cause it supported. I found myself nodding, even though every instinct was screaming that I should explain the misunderstanding and extract myself from the situation before it became even more complicated. But Jessica was already writing my name on her form, and Patricia was radiating satisfaction like heat from a furnace. "Wonderful," Jessica said, making notes on her paperwork. "We have you down for a solo vocal performance, approximately 3 to 4 minutes in length. Second half of the program. Patricia mentioned that you might be interested in performing something with acoustic guitar accompaniment, but she wasn't sure if you'd be providing your own musician or if you'd need us to arrange something." The acoustic guitar detail was news. To me, another embellishment Patricia had added to make my fictional performance more interesting to the organizing committee. I didn't play guitar, had never expressed interest in guitar accompaniment, and certainly hadn't discussed any such arrangement with Patricia. But she'd apparently decided that my imaginary musical talents included the ability to coordinate with instrumentalists, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. "Actually, I think I'll keep it simple with just the vocal," I said, hoping to eliminate at least one variable from the equation. "I work better with minimal accompaniment, so just the microphone should be perfect." Jessica made another note on her form. "That's completely fine. Some of our most memorable performances over the years have been simple vocal pieces. There's something very powerful about the human voice standing alone, without instrumental support to hide behind. It takes real confidence to put yourself out there like that." Her comment was probably meant to be encouraging, but it only emphasized the vulnerability of what Patricia had committed me to. Standing alone on stage with only my voice and whatever song I could manage to prepare in less than 3 weeks, suddenly, felt like the emotional equivalent of public surgery. Every mistake would be audible, every moment of nervousness visible, every inadequacy exposed under the bright lights Jessica was currently discussing. "We'll have standard stage lighting, nothing too dramatic since we're working with a mixed program of different performance styles. The acoustics in our main auditorium are quite good, so you shouldn't have any trouble being heard in the back rows. Have you performed in a space that size before, or would you like to schedule a quick visit to get familiar with the stage setup?" The question revealed how thoroughly Patricia had misrepresented my experience level. Jessica was speaking to me, as if I were a seasoned performer who might have specific requirements and professional concerns about venue acoustics. She had no idea that my most recent public singing experience had been a whispered hymn at my mother's funeral, or that the thought of performing solo in front of 300 people was causing my heart to race even during this casual conversation. "I think a quick visit would be helpful," I said, recognizing that I needed to understand exactly what I was facing if I was going to find a way through this situation. "Just to get a sense of the space and maybe do a brief sound check when it's convenient." Jessica nodded approvingly. "That's very professional of you. We can arrange that for sometime next week, after our regular programming winds down in the evenings. I'll coordinate with Patricia on the scheduling, since I know she's familiar with your availability." The assumption that Patricia was familiar with my availability was another reminder of how thoroughly she'd inserted herself into arrangements that should have been mine to make. Jessica was treating Patricia as my manager or representative, someone authorized to speak on my behalf and coordinate my professional activities. It was a role Patricia had apparently claimed without asking, adding another dimension to her manipulation that extended beyond simply signing me up to perform. Patricia was practically glowing with satisfaction as Jessica gathered her paperwork and prepared to leave. She'd successfully positioned herself as the facilitator of my participation while maintaining the appearance of supportive family member rather than controlling manipulator. To Jessica, Patricia appeared to be an encouraging mother-in-law helping her shy daughter-in-law overcome performance anxiety and contribute to community life. The reality of coercion and unwanted commitment was invisible beneath Patricia's carefully constructed narrative. After Jessica left, Patricia remained in the living room, clearly expecting some expression of gratitude for the opportunity she'd created. She arranged herself on the sofa with the satisfied posture of someone who'd completed an important task successfully, her expression expectant as she waited for me to acknowledge her efforts on my behalf. "Well, that went smoothly," she said when I failed to provide the thanks she was anticipating. "Jessica seems very organized, and I think you'll find the whole experience quite rewarding. It's not often we get opportunities to step outside our comfort zones and discover new aspects of ourselves. Her words carried the tone of someone dispensing wisdom, as if signing me up to perform without consent was an act of tough love rather than boundary violation. Patricia genuinely seemed to believe that she'd done me a favor, that forcing me into public performance would somehow unlock personal growth that I'd been too timid to pursue independently. The possibility that I might have valid reasons for avoiding musical performance, or that those reasons deserved respect rather than override, apparently hadn't occurred to her. "Patricia, I need you to understand something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anxiety coursing through my system. "I haven't sung publicly in years. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this kind of performance, and I'm worried about disappointing everyone who's expecting something I might not be able to deliver." She waved away my concerns with the same dismissive gesture she'd used that morning in the kitchen. "Oh, Emma, you're just nervous. Everyone gets stage fright before their first community performance. But once you're up there, the adrenaline takes over and you'll find yourself rising to the occasion. Besides, it's not like you're performing at Carnegie Hall. It's just neighbors and friends, people who want to support you." The Carnegie Hall reference felt particularly pointed, given that she'd used similar language to dismiss my concerns about needing professional-level preparation. Patricia had a talent for minimizing the significance of challenges while simultaneously emphasizing my obligation to overcome them. The talent showcase was simultaneously just a small community event and an important opportunity that I couldn't waste, depending on which framing better served her argument. I spent the rest of that afternoon trying to focus on lesson planning and grading, but my concentration kept drifting to the conversation with Jessica and the growing realization of what Patricia had set in motion. Every few minutes, my mind would present new details about the performance situation, each one more anxiety-provoking than the last. 300 people. Second half of the program. Programs already being printed with my name and whatever song title I'd have to provide by Friday. That evening, when David came home from his shift at the hospital, Patricia was waiting with the news of Jessica's visit and my successful meeting with the talent showcase coordinator. She presented the update as if reporting on a successful job interview, emphasizing Jessica's professionalism and the prime placement I'd received in the program lineup. David listened with the distracted attention of someone exhausted from 12 hours of medical crises, nodding appropriately but clearly not processing the full implications of what his mother was describing. "That's great, honey," he said, giving me a tired kiss on the forehead. "I'm proud of you for getting involved in community stuff. Mom's been talking about this talent show for months, so it'll be nice for you to be part of something she cares about." His response revealed how effectively Patricia had framed my participation as voluntary community involvement rather than involuntary commitment. To David, I was a supportive spouse, choosing to participate in his mother's interests, rather than someone who'd been manipulated into a situation I'd never wanted. Patricia's narrative had successfully obscured the coercion, leaving me looking ungrateful if I complained about an opportunity that appeared generous and supportive. Later that night, lying in bed beside David while he slept the deep sleep of physical exhaustion, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how my life had been reorganized without my consent. In less than 12 hours, I'd gone from someone who avoided musical situations to someone committed to solo performance in front of the largest audience I'd ever faced. Patricia had transformed me from observer to participant with a few phone calls and strategic presentations that made resistance seem selfish and ungrateful. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the performance itself, though that was terrifying enough. It was the recognition of how skillfully Patricia had manipulated social expectations and charitable obligations to trap me in a commitment I couldn't escape without appearing to betray community values. She'd weaponized generosity and civic responsibility, turning my own decency into the mechanism of my coercion. But underneath the anxiety and resentment, something else was stirring. It was faint and complicated, wrapped in 5 years of grief and self-protection, but it was unmistakably there. It was the ghost of my mother's voice, the memory of music that had once been central to my identity before loss taught me to fear it. Patricia thought she was setting me up for humiliation, but she'd accidentally reopened a door I'd thought was permanently sealed. Sunday dinner at the Chen household followed a ritual as precisely choreographed as a ballet, with Patricia directing the performance from her position at the head of the table. She'd claimed that seat when David and I moved in temporarily, explaining that her hip surgery made it easier for her to coordinate serving and cleanup from the central location. But 3 months later, with her hip fully recovered, she remained in command of the dining room like a general overseeing troops, her authority reinforced by the elaborate place settings and cloth napkins she insisted were necessary for proper family meals. David sat to her right, still wearing his hospital scrubs because he'd been called in for an emergency surgery that morning, and barely made it home in time for Patricia's mandatory family gathering. His exhaustion was visible in the slight slump of his shoulders and the way he mechanically cut his pot roast without really tasting it. 12-hour shifts at Riverside General had become 14-hour marathons lately, as the hospital struggled with staffing shortages that left experienced nurses like David covering multiple departments while training new graduates who weren't ready for the responsibility. I occupied the chair across from David, watching the familiar dynamics play out while picking at the green bean casserole Patricia had prepared, according to a recipe she claimed had been in the Chen family for generations. The beans were overcooked, and the sauce was too thick. But commenting on Patricia's cooking was one of many subjects that had been declared off-limits during our cohabitation. She accepted compliments graciously and ignored anything that might be construed as criticism, creating a feedback loop that perpetuated mediocre meals while reinforcing her position as the household's culinary authority. The conversation flowed around topics Patricia deemed appropriate for Sunday dinner: David's work schedule, neighborhood gossip filtered through her bridge club network, and updates on community events that might require our attendance or financial support. She spoke with the confident authority of someone accustomed to controlling social situations, her voice filling the dining room while David and I provided the minimal responses necessary to keep her monologue flowing smoothly. Patricia had perfected the art of disguising interrogation as casual conversation, extracting information about our plans and preferences while appearing to simply share family time. She wanted to know which weekends David might have off, whether I'd heard from any of my college friends recently, and if we'd given any more thought to buying a house of our own rather than continuing to rent the apartment we'd left behind when we moved in to help with her recovery. Each question was presented as maternal interest, but the underlying message was clear. Our lives were subject to her review and commentary. "David, you look tired, sweetheart." Patricia's tone carried the perfect blend of concern and criticism that she'd mastered over decades of motherhood. "I hope you're not letting the hospital take advantage of your dedication. You work much harder than the other nurses, and they should recognize that with better scheduling and compensation." Her observation was accurate but unhelpful, since David had no control over hospital staffing decisions or his own schedule. Patricia frequently offered this kind of supportive criticism, acknowledging the challenges David faced while implying that he wasn't assertive enough in demanding better treatment from his employers. It was a subtle way of undermining his professional judgment while appearing to advocate for his interests. "Mom, we've talked about this. The hospital is doing their best with limited resources." David's response was patient but weary, the tone of someone who'd had this conversation multiple times. "Everyone's working extra shifts right now. It's not personal, and it's not something I can change by being more demanding." Patricia made a small sound of disapproval, the kind that suggested she wasn't convinced by his explanation, but was willing to let the subject drop for now. She turned her attention to me, her expression shifting to the bright interest she displayed when introducing topics she considered important. "Emma, I've been thinking about your upcoming performance at the talent showcase. Have you decided what song you'll be singing?" I mentioned to Linda Park that you were still choosing between several options, and she was quite curious about your musical background. Apparently, her daughter took voice lessons for years. So Linda considers herself something of an expert on vocal performance. The transition was seamless, moving from concern about David's work situation to excitement about my involuntary commitment to public performance. Patricia's ability to shift between topics while maintaining emotional momentum was one of her most effective manipulation techniques, keeping conversations moving in directions she preferred while making resistance seem churlish or inappropriate. "I'm still working on that decision," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the familiar surge of anxiety that accompanied any discussion of the talent showcase. "I want to choose something that fits the event's theme and my own vocal range, so I'm taking some time to consider the options carefully." My response was deliberately vague, but Patricia seized on it as an opportunity to demonstrate her expertise and helpfulness. "Oh, that's very wise. Choosing the right song is crucial for a successful performance. You want something that showcases your abilities without being too challenging, something the audience will recognize and appreciate. Have you considered any contemporary pieces? I know the younger people in the audience would enjoy something current rather than traditional." Her suggestion revealed the assumptions she'd made about my musical preferences and abilities. Patricia had apparently decided that I was most suited for contemporary pop music, probably something safe and familiar that wouldn't challenge audience expectations or require sophisticated vocal technique. She was steering me toward the kind of performance she considered appropriate for someone of my age and community status, rather than anything that might reflect my actual musical background or interests. David looked up from his plate, seeming to notice the conversation for the first time. "You're really going to sing at Mom's talent show?" His surprise was genuine and slightly alarming, suggesting that Patricia hadn't provided him with accurate information about my voluntary participation. "That's great, honey. I didn't know you were interested in performing. You hardly ever sing around the house." His observation highlighted one of the many contradictions in Patricia's narrative about my hidden musical talents. If I possessed the kind of vocal abilities that warranted showcase placement, it would be reasonable to expect some evidence of musical activity in our daily life. But David's comment revealed that I'd successfully avoided singing in his presence for the entire duration of our relationship, hardly consistent with Patricia's claims about my secret artistic gifts. "Well, Emma's always been modest about her talents," Patricia interjected smoothly, covering for the inconsistency without missing a beat. "Some people prefer to keep their artistic abilities private until they find the right opportunity to share them publicly. I think the talent showcase will be perfect for Emma to step out of her shell and show everyone what she's capable of." Her explanation transformed my absence of musical behavior from evidence against her claims into proof of mysterious depths that only she had been perceptive enough to recognize. Patricia had reframed my lack of singing as artistic temperament, rather than genuine absence of ability or interest, creating a narrative that made her intervention seem insightful rather than presumptuous. The conversation continued around me while I struggled with the growing realization that David had no understanding of what his mother had orchestrated or how I felt about being volunteered for public performance. Patricia had successfully presented my participation as enthusiastic community involvement, leaving me unable to express my actual feelings without seeming ungrateful for opportunities that appeared generous and supportive. "I think it's wonderful that you're getting involved in community activities," David continued, his words heavy with the exhaustion that made complex thinking difficult. "You've seemed a little isolated since we moved in here, so it'll be good for you to meet more people and have something creative to focus on." His assessment stung because it contained enough truth to be difficult to refute. I had felt isolated during our 3 months of living with Patricia, cut off from the routines and relationships that had anchored my life in our previous apartment. But David attributed that isolation to my own social limitations, rather than the challenging dynamics of living with his mother, missing the way Patricia's constant presence and commentary had gradually eroded my sense of independence and personal space. Patricia smiled with satisfaction, clearly pleased that David was reinforcing her narrative about the benefits of my talent showcase participation. She'd successfully positioned herself as someone who recognized my needs and provided opportunities for growth, rather than someone who'd violated my boundaries and ignored my preferences. To David, she appeared to be a supportive mother-in-law helping her daughter-in-law integrate into community life. The rest of dinner proceeded with Patricia's usual mixture of family updates and social commentary, but I found it difficult to focus on her words. My attention kept drifting to the realization that I was completely alone in understanding what had actually happened when she signed me up to perform. David saw enthusiastic community involvement where I experienced coercion. Patricia's friends saw generous family support where I felt manipulation and control. After dinner, I volunteered to handle the dishes while David retreated to the living room couch for the brief nap that had become his Sunday afternoon routine. Patricia remained in the kitchen, ostensibly to help with cleanup, but actually to continue our conversation about the talent showcase without David's distracted presence. She dried dishes with the methodical precision of someone who'd been performing domestic tasks for decades, her movements efficient and automatic. "Emma, I hope you know how proud I am of you for taking on this challenge." Patricia's voice carried the warm approval she typically reserved for David's professional achievements or news about neighbors' children who'd earned academic honors. "It takes real courage to put yourself out there artistically, and I think you'll find the experience quite transformative." Her praise felt more manipulative than encouraging, designed to reinforce the narrative that my participation was voluntary and praiseworthy rather than coerced and unwanted. Patricia was investing in the fiction that she'd simply provided an opportunity that I'd been eager to embrace, rather than forcing me into a commitment that served her interests more than mine. "I've been thinking about your song choice," she continued, arranging the dried dishes in precise stacks according to her preferred organizational system. "Linda Park suggested that you might consider something with a message, perhaps something inspirational that reflects the talent showcase's theme about hidden potential. The audience always responds well to performances that make them feel uplifted rather than just entertained." Her suggestion revealed another layer of expectation about my performance, the idea that I should provide emotional labor for the audience rather than simply sharing whatever musical abilities I might possess. Patricia wanted me to deliver inspiration, along with entertainment, transforming my performance into a kind of motivational speaking enhanced by melody. The pressure to uplift and encourage strangers added another dimension to an already overwhelming commitment. "Patricia," I said carefully, setting down the serving bowl I'd been washing and turning to face her directly. "I need you to understand that this is really difficult for me. I haven't performed in public for years, and I'm genuinely worried about disappointing everyone who's expecting something I might not be able to deliver." She paused in her dish-drying routine, giving me the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for important community center business or medical updates about neighbors' health crises. For a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge the coercive nature of what she'd done and offer some kind of exit strategy that would allow me to withdraw without losing face. "Oh, sweetheart, everyone gets nervous before their first big performance." Patricia's response was gentle but dismissive, treating my concerns as temporary anxiety rather than legitimate objection. "But you know what I've learned from years of organizing community events? The people who are most worried about disappointing others are usually the ones who end up exceeding everyone's expectations." Her reassurance was expertly crafted to sound supportive while completely ignoring the substance of what I'd tried to communicate. She'd transformed my expression of genuine distress into evidence of admirable humility, making it impossible to continue objecting without seeming to fish for more compliments or reassurance. Patricia had effectively closed down the conversation while appearing to address my concerns. That night, after David had fallen asleep beside me with the sudden completeness of someone whose body demanded rest regardless of circumstances, I lay awake thinking about the dinner conversation and what it revealed about my position in the Chen family dynamics. Patricia controlled the narrative about my talent showcase participation so completely that even my husband believed I was a willing and enthusiastic participant rather than someone who'd been manipulated into an impossible situation. The isolation was more complete than I'd initially realized. Patricia had created a version of reality where her manipulation appeared as generous support, my coercion looked like voluntary participation, and my distress seemed like simple stage fright that would resolve itself through positive thinking and community encouragement. Anyone who tried to help me escape the situation would appear to be discouraging personal growth and community involvement. But the most disturbing realization was that David's exhaustion and distraction had made him an unknowing accomplice to his mother's manipulation. He wasn't intentionally supporting Patricia's coercion, but his inability to recognize what was happening left me without the ally I most needed. His genuine pride in what he believed was my voluntary community involvement made it impossible to explain the reality of the situation without seeming to criticize his perception and judgment. I turned onto my side and watched David sleep, his face relaxed in a way it never was during his waking hours anymore. The hospital demands had worn him down to the point where home was simply the place he recovered between shifts, rather than the sanctuary where he engaged fully with our relationship and family dynamics. The official program arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a crisp white envelope bearing the Maplewood Community Center's logo and Patricia's name written in careful calligraphy. I found it propped against the salt and pepper shakers on the kitchen table, positioned like a centerpiece that demanded attention from anyone entering the room. Patricia had clearly placed it there deliberately, probably after opening it privately, to review its contents before sharing the moment with the rest of the household. She was already dressed in her powder blue tracksuit, the one she wore for important errands and social obligations that required her to look put together, but not overdressed. Her hair was styled with more attention than usual, and she'd applied the coral lipstick she saved for occasions when she expected to encounter people whose opinions mattered to her social standing. The preparation suggested that receiving the official program was an event worthy of documentation and celebration. "Go ahead, dear. Open it," Patricia said, settling into her chair with the satisfied posture of someone who'd orchestrated a surprise party. She had her phone positioned at an angle that would capture my reaction when I discovered whatever she expected to be delightful about the program's contents. The staging felt calculated, designed to create a moment she could later describe to Linda Park and her other Bridge Club friends as evidence of my excitement about participating in the showcase. I picked up the envelope with more caution than Patricia probably expected, already sensing that whatever was inside would complicate my situation further, rather than provide the clarity I'd been hoping for. The paper felt expensive, heavier than typical community center communications, suggesting that the organizing committee had invested in professional printing services rather than relying on the standard photocopying equipment they used for most announcements. The program opened to reveal a glossy booklet with full-color photographs of the community center and various action shots from previous year's talent showcases. The production values were impressive for a small-town fundraiser, clearly designed to make participants and sponsors feel that their involvement supported something significant and professionally managed. Patricia and her committee had created the kind of program that people would keep as mementos rather than discard after the event. I flipped through the pages, noting the detailed biographies of longtime participants, complete with professional headshots and descriptions of their training and performance history. Local dance studios were represented with group photos and lists of awards their students had earned at regional competitions. A barbershop quartet included information about their 40-year history of community performances and their recent selection for a state music festival. Then I found my page, and my stomach dropped like an elevator with severed cables. The photograph was one I'd never authorized or even known was being taken. It showed me sitting at the upright piano in the community center's lobby during my visit with Jessica Wong. My head turned slightly away from the camera with an expression that looked more melancholy than musical. Someone had captured me in a moment of private reflection and transformed it into a publicity shot without my knowledge or consent. But the photograph was only the beginning of the disaster. Beneath it, in elegant script font, was my biography, as reimagined by Patricia and the organizing committee. Emma Rodriguez-Chen brings a lifetime of musical passion to this year's showcase, having studied voice privately since childhood before taking a brief hiatus to focus on her teaching career. Her return to performance represents the kind of artistic renewal that exemplifies our hidden talents, bright futures theme. Every word was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. I'd never studied voice privately, having learned to sing entirely from my mother in our kitchen while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. My hiatus from performance hadn't been brief, and it certainly hadn't been voluntary. The description made me sound like a trained musician returning to the stage after a strategic career break, rather than someone who'd been avoiding music for 5 years because it was too painful to engage with after losing the person who'd taught me to love it. The biography continued with even more creative interpretation of my background. Drawing from her rich cultural heritage and deep connection to traditional folk music, Emma will present an acoustic performance that promises to surprise and inspire our community. Her unique voice carries the authenticity that can only come from genuine life experience and artistic integrity. The reference to my cultural heritage felt particularly cynical, suggesting that Patricia had decided to market my Mexican background as part of the performance's appeal, without bothering to learn anything about my actual relationship to traditional Mexican music or folk traditions. She'd reduced my identity to a marketing hook, assuming that ethnicity was interchangeable with artistic authenticity, regardless of my personal connection to the cultural elements she was advertising. Patricia watched my face carefully as I read, clearly expecting some expression of pleasure or gratitude for the flattering biography she'd helped craft. Her smile began to falter when I remained silent, my expression growing more troubled with each fabricated detail I discovered. The program was beautiful, professionally designed, and completely disconnected from reality. Isn't it wonderful how they captured your artistic essence? Patricia's voice carried a slight edge of uncertainty, as if she was beginning to recognize that my reaction wasn't matching her expectations. Jessica and I worked quite hard on your biography to make sure it conveyed the right tone for the kind of performance you'll be giving. The collaboration she described revealed how extensively she'd been involved in crafting the narrative about my participation. Patricia hadn't simply signed me up and left the details to the organizing committee. She'd actively shaped the way my performance would be presented to the community, creating expectations that bore no relationship to my actual abilities or background. Patricia, this biography isn't accurate. I tried to keep my voice steady despite the growing panic that was making it difficult to breathe normally. I've never studied voice privately, and I'm certainly not qualified to represent any kind of cultural heritage through traditional folk music. People are going to expect something based on this description that I can't possibly deliver. She waved away my concerns with the dismissive gesture that had become increasingly familiar during our months of cohabitation. Oh, Emma, you're being too modest again. Of course you've studied voice, just not in a formal classroom setting. Learning from your mother counts as private instruction, probably more valuable than anything you could have gotten from a traditional teacher. Her reinterpretation of my musical education transformed my mother's kitchen singing lessons into professional training, imposing a framework of formal instruction on what had been intimate family bonding. Patricia had taken the most precious musical memories of my childhood and repackaged them as credentials that justified her claims about my performance capabilities. The cultural heritage reference was also completely appropriate, she continued, her tone growing more defensive as she recognized my distress. You are Mexican-American, and folk music is part of that tradition. You don't need to be a scholar of ethnomusicology to perform songs that connect to your family background. Her logic was superficially reasonable but fundamentally flawed, assuming that ethnic identity automatically conferred musical expertise regardless of personal experience or training. Patricia had decided that my cultural background was a performance asset that could be deployed to enhance the talent showcase's diversity and appeal, without considering whether I had any actual connection to the musical tradition she was advertising. I closed the program and set it on the table with the careful control of someone handling dangerous materials. The biographical fabrications were problematic enough, but they also revealed the extent to which Patricia had committed me to specific performance expectations that would be impossible to modify without significant embarrassment. The program was already printed, probably distributed to sponsors and committee members, making any corrections seem like admissions of inadequacy or deception. Patricia, I need you to understand that this description creates expectations I can't eat. My voice cracked slightly as I spoke, betraying the emotional strain that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. People who read this will expect a polished performance by someone with formal training and cultural expertise. I'm a third-grade teacher who learned to sing from her mother. This isn't fair to me or to the audience. She leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from defensive to what she probably intended as compassionate, but felt more like condescending. Emma, sweetheart, I think you're underestimating yourself because you're nervous. Everyone who performs publicly deals with imposter syndrome, the feeling that they're not qualified to be on stage. But the committee chose to include you in the program because they believe in your potential. The imposter syndrome explanation was particularly galling because it suggested that my concerns about false advertising were actually evidence of psychological weakness rather than accurate assessment of my abilities. Patricia had transformed my objections to her fabrications into symptoms of low self-esteem, making it impossible to argue without seeming to need therapy rather than honest representation. But the morning's humiliation was only beginning. As I sat at the kitchen table trying to process the implications of the printed program, my phone began buzzing with text messages from numbers I didn't immediately recognize. The first few seemed innocent enough. Congratulations from neighbors who'd apparently received early copies of the program and wanted to express their excitement about my upcoming performance. Emma, I had no idea you were such an accomplished singer. Looking forward to hearing you at the showcase. This from Mrs. Martinez, who lived 3 houses down and usually only spoke to me about trash collection schedules and homeowners association business. So excited to finally hear you perform. Your cultural heritage performance sounds absolutely fascinating. I've always been interested in traditional Mexican folk music. This message came from someone named Jennifer, who I eventually remembered. As a parent from my school, though I'd never had more than brief conversations with her during pickup and drop-off. The congratulations continued throughout the morning, each message revealing how widely the program had been distributed and how many people were now expecting a performance that bore no resemblance to anything I could actually deliver. Patricia had effectively trapped me in a web of community expectations that would make withdrawal impossible without disappointing dozens of people who were genuinely looking forward to what they'd been promised. But the messages took a more troubling turn as the day progressed. By noon, I was receiving texts that suggested some community members had concerns about the authenticity of my biographical description. The tone remained polite, but underlying. Skepticism was becoming apparent in the carefully worded questions about my background and training. Hi, Emma. I was surprised to see you're performing traditional folk music since I've never heard you mention musical training before. Are you working with a cultural consultant to ensure authentic representation? This from Rachel Torres, my colleague at Riverside Elementary, who knew me well enough to recognize the disconnect between my public persona and the artistic claims being made on my behalf. The message from Rachel was particularly devastating because it came from someone who'd witnessed my daily interactions for 3 years and never seen evidence of the musical background being advertised in the program. If my own colleagues were questioning the authenticity of the biographical claims, word would spread quickly through the close-knit community of educators who formed a significant portion of the talent showcase audience. More concerning were the messages that suggested some community members felt misled by the cultural heritage marketing being used to promote my performance. The program's emphasis on traditional folk music and authentic representation had apparently created expectations about cultural education and historical accuracy that extended far beyond simple entertainment. Emma, my grandmother emigrated from Jalisco in the 1940s, and I'm very interested in hearing how you'll present traditional songs from our region. Will you be performing in Spanish or English? Are you collaborating with any local mariachi musicians? This from someone named Carlos, whose number I didn't recognize but whose message carried the weight of genuine cultural investment in what the program had promised. The mounting pressure was becoming unbearable. Patricia's fabricated biography had committed me not only to a level of musical performance I couldn't deliver, but also to cultural representation that would require expertise and sensitivity I didn't possess. She'd transformed my involuntary participation into a kind of fraud that would disappoint people who had legitimate interests in authentic cultural sharing and artistic excellence. By mid-afternoon, Patricia had begun receiving her own phone calls about my upcoming performance, conversations I could overhear from the kitchen where I was trying to focus on lesson planning despite the growing crisis. Her friends from Bridge Club were calling with questions that revealed how much speculation my participation had generated within her social circle. "Oh, Linda, I'm so glad you called." "Yes. Isn't it wonderful that Emma finally decided to share her talents with the community?" Patricia's voice carried forced enthusiasm that suggested even she was beginning to recognize that the situation was becoming more complicated than she'd anticipated. "No, I don't think she'll be needing backup dancers. It's going to be a very intimate, authentic performance." The word authentic felt particularly ironic, given how thoroughly the program had misrepresented everything about my background and capabilities. Patricia was now committed to defending biographical claims she'd helped create, forced to elaborate on fabrications that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain under the scrutiny of community members who knew me personally. Her conversation with Linda continued for nearly an hour, with Patricia providing increasingly creative explanations for questions about my musical training and cultural expertise. I could hear her constructing elaborate justifications for why I'd never mentioned my artistic background before, and why none of my colleagues or neighbors had witnessed evidence of the talents being advertised in the program. "She's always been very private about her artistic side," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the strain of someone working hard to maintain a story that was becoming less believable with each elaboration. "Some people prefer to keep their cultural practices within the family until they find the right opportunity to share them publicly." The explanation was creative but problematic, suggesting that I'd been hiding significant aspects of my identity and heritage, rather than simply lacking the qualifications Patricia had claimed on my behalf. She was painting me as mysteriously secretive, rather than acknowledging that her biographical descriptions were exaggerated beyond recognition. When Patricia finally ended her call with Linda, she found me still sitting at the kitchen table with the program open in front of me, and my phone displaying the growing collection of messages from community members with questions I couldn't answer. Her expression was less confident than it had been that morning, suggesting that her friends' inquiries had begun to reveal the potential complications of the narrative she'd constructed. "Emma, I think we might need to discuss your performance strategy in more detail." Patricia's tone was more subdued than usual, carrying the first hints of recognition that her management of the situation might have created problems rather than opportunities. "Some people seem to have very specific expectations about what you'll be presenting, and we want to make sure you're prepared to meet them appropriately." Her suggestion that we needed to develop a performance strategy revealed how completely she'd avoided considering the practical implications of her biographical fabrications. Patricia had been so focused on creating an impressive program listing that she'd ignored the necessity of ensuring I could actually deliver what was being advertised. Now, with 3 weeks remaining before the performance, she was beginning to realize that good intentions and positive thinking wouldn't bridge the gap between marketing claims and performance reality. The rest of that day passed in a haze of increasing anxiety as more messages arrived, and Patricia fielded additional phone calls from community members who wanted clarification about various aspects of my upcoming performance. By evening, it was clear that my participation in the talent showcase had become a topic of significant community interest, with expectations and speculation that extended far beyond anything Patricia had originally envisioned. David came home that night to find me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed programs, my phone displaying dozens of messages, and Patricia pacing nervously between the kitchen and living room while conducting whispered phone conversations with her committee colleagues. The scene suggested crisis management rather than performance preparation, immediately alerting him that something had gone seriously wrong with what he'd understood to be straightforward community involvement. "What's happening here?" David's question was directed to both of us, but his eyes were focused on my obviously distressed expression and the evidence of community attention scattered across the kitchen table. "You both look like someone died. Is there a problem with the talent show?" His observation was accurate enough to be almost funny if the situation hadn't been so devastating. Something had died. Specifically, the possibility that I could participate in the talent showcase without disappointing dozens of people who'd been led to expect something I couldn't deliver. Patricia's well-intentioned manipulation had created a community-wide misunderstanding that would be impossible to correct without significant embarrassment for everyone involved. Patricia stepped forward to provide her version of the day's developments, clearly hoping to maintain some control over how the situation was presented to David. "There's been wonderful response to Emma's program listing, but some people have very detailed questions about her performance. I think they're just excited to learn more about her artistic background." Her explanation minimized the scope of the problem while presenting community scrutiny as evidence of enthusiasm rather than skepticism. But David had enough medical training to recognize crisis management when he saw it, and his expression grew more concerned as he absorbed the obvious signs of stress radiating from both his wife and mother. "Emma, what's really going on?" David's question was gentle but direct, offering me the first opportunity all day to present my perspective without Patricia's editorial control. "You look like you're about to have a panic attack, and Mom looks like she's trying to solve some kind of emergency. What's the real story here?" The invitation to honesty was exactly what I needed, but it also presented the challenge of explaining Patricia's manipulation to her son without seeming to attack her character or criticize her intentions. The truth was complex and emotionally charged, involving family dynamics and boundary violations that would be difficult to articulate without causing relationship damage that would extend far beyond the talent showcase crisis. "David," I said carefully, trying to find words that would convey the reality of the situation without unnecessarily inflaming family tensions. "Your mother created a biography for the program that doesn't accurately represent my background or abilities. Now people have expectations about my performance that I'm not qualified to meet, and I'm not sure how to handle the situation without disappointing everyone involved." His expression shifted from concern to confusion as he processed what I'd said, clearly struggling to understand how program biographical information could create the kind of crisis he was witnessing. David had never been involved in community theater or public performance, making it difficult for him to grasp how promotional materials could trap someone in commitments they couldn't fulfill. Patricia immediately stepped in to provide her perspective. On the biographical accuracy question, maintaining the defensive posture she'd adopted during her afternoon phone calls. "Emma's being too modest about her qualifications, as usual. The biography accurately reflects her musical background, just presented in language that makes it sound more formal than she's comfortable with." Her explanation reframed factual inaccuracy as modesty and presentation style, suggesting that my objections were based on personal discomfort rather than legitimate concerns about false advertising. Patricia was maintaining her position that the program's biographical claims were essentially accurate, just expressed in terms that made me nervous about living up to the expectations they created. The three of us stood in the kitchen surrounded by evidence of community attention and growing expectations, each of us understanding the situation differently and hoping for resolution strategies that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. Patricia wanted to maintain the narrative she'd created while ensuring I delivered a performance that would justify her claims. David wanted to understand why a community talent show was causing family crisis. I wanted to escape a situation that felt increasingly like preparation for public humiliation. The phone rang at 7:30 on Wednesday morning, while I was still in my pajamas grading spelling tests at the kitchen table and trying to pretend that the talent showcase crisis might resolve itself through sheer avoidance. Patricia answered on the second ring with the artificially cheerful voice she reserved for important community center business, her tone immediately shifting to the focused attention she gave to calls that might affect her social standing or committee responsibilities. "Jessica, how lovely to hear from you so early. I hope everything is going smoothly with the final preparations." Patricia's side of the conversation was deliberately loud enough for me to overhear, clearly intended to draw me into whatever discussion was taking place about my upcoming performance. She made eye contact with me while speaking, her expression carrying the expectant quality that meant she wanted my full attention for whatever announcement was coming. I set down my red pen and listened with growing apprehension as Patricia's responses became increasingly animated. "Oh, that sounds like a wonderful opportunity. Yes, I'm sure Emma would be thrilled to be part of something so special. When would she need to be there for rehearsals?" Her enthusiasm was building with each exchange, suggesting that Jessica was proposing some kind of enhancement to my already overwhelming commitment. After several minutes of excited agreement to terms I couldn't hear, Patricia hung up and turned to me with the radiant smile she typically reserved for announcing what she considered excellent news. "Emma, you're not going to believe this wonderful development. Jessica just called with the most amazing opportunity for your performance." The word opportunity had become increasingly ominous during my weeks of living with Patricia's management of my talent showcase participation. Her opportunities invariably involved additional complications, higher expectations, or increased public attention that made already difficult situations exponentially more challenging. I braced myself for whatever enhancement she was about to reveal. It turns out that Miguel Santos, the mariachi musician who owns the music store downtown, had to cancel his performance due to a family emergency. Patricia's excitement was building as she delivered what she clearly considered fantastic news. His cancellation left a significant gap in the second half of the program, right before the grand finale. Jessica asked if you'd be willing to extend your performance to fill that slot. The implications hit me like cold water. Miguel Santos was a professional musician with decades of experience performing for community events and private celebrations. His performances typically lasted 15 to 20 minutes and included multiple songs with instrumental accompaniment and often audience participation. Patricia was suggesting that I could somehow replace a seasoned professional with what I'd been planning as a single 3-minute song. "Patricia, I can't replace Miguel Santos." My voice carried more panic than I'd intended, but the suggestion was so far beyond my capabilities that calm response seemed impossible. "He's a professional musician with years of experience and specialized equipment. I don't have the repertoire or the training to fill a 20-minute performance slot designed for someone with his background." She waved away my concerns with the confident dismissal that had become her standard response to any objection I raised about the evolving expectations surrounding my participation. "Nonsense, dear. Jessica specifically said they were looking for someone who could provide authentic cultural representation, and your biographical background makes you perfect for the role." The word authentic felt particularly cruel given how extensively Patricia had fabricated the biographical claims that were now being used to justify increasingly unrealistic performance expectations. Her marketing of my supposed cultural expertise had created a situation where community organizers genuinely believed I possessed qualifications that existed only in the program's fictional biography. "But there's more wonderful news," Patricia continued, her enthusiasm apparently undaunted by my obvious distress. "Linda Park's daughter Monica is home from college for spring break, and she plays classical guitar. Jessica thought it would be perfect if you two collaborated on a joint performance that combines your vocal abilities with Monica's instrumental skills." The collaboration suggestion revealed another layer of complication that Patricia had apparently agreed to without consulting me. Monica Park was a music major at UC Santa Barbara, with formal training and performance experience that would make my amateur abilities embarrassingly obvious by comparison. Pairing me with a trained musician would highlight every limitation I possessed while creating additional pressure to deliver professional-level performance quality. Patricia, I've never worked with Monica, and I don't know her musical style or repertoire. The logistics of arranging a collaboration in less than 3 weeks seemed impossible, even if I'd been genuinely qualified for the enhanced performance slot. We'd need time to rehearse together, select appropriate songs, and coordinate our different skill levels. This isn't something that can be arranged casually without proper preparation. Her expression shifted slightly, the first sign that she might be beginning to recognize the practical complications of the commitments she'd been making on my behalf. But her response maintained the optimistic tone she'd been using throughout the talent showcase planning process, apparently believing that enthusiasm could overcome logistical obstacles. "Oh, I'm sure you and Monica will work beautifully together." Patricia's confidence seemed increasingly detached from reality, as the scope of my commitments expanded beyond anything I could reasonably manage. Young people are so creative and adaptable. You'll probably come up with something wonderful in just a few rehearsal sessions. The assumption that creativity and adaptability could substitute for experience and preparation revealed how little Patricia understood about musical collaboration or public performance. She seemed to believe that good intentions and positive attitude could bridge the gap between amateur and professional capabilities, ignoring the years of training and practice that separated competent musicians from enthusiastic beginners. But the morning's revelations weren't finished. Patricia's phone rang again while I was still processing the implications of the extended performance slot and unwanted collaboration. This time, her conversation was briefer, but carried an edge of tension that suggested additional complications. "We're emerging from the community center's planning process." "I see. Well, yes, I suppose that does change things somewhat." Patricia's responses were more cautious than her previous conversation with Jessica, suggesting that this call was delivering less welcome news about my participation. "Let me discuss this with Emma and get back to you this afternoon." When she hung up, Patricia's expression was more subdued than it had been since the program's arrival 2 days earlier. Her confidence was still intact, but it was tempered by the first hints of recognition that the situation was becoming more complex than she'd originally anticipated. "That was Jessica again," she said, settling into her chair with less enthusiasm than she'd shown during the previous conversation. "There's been some additional interest in your performance from people who read the program. Apparently, several community members with Mexican heritage have reached out to the organizing committee with questions about the traditional folk music you'll be presenting." The news confirmed my worst fears about the cultural heritage claims Patricia had included in my biographical description. Real community members with genuine connections to Mexican musical traditions were expecting authentic representation that I was completely unqualified to provide. Patricia's marketing strategy had created expectations among people who would immediately recognize my lack of cultural knowledge and musical expertise. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would only confirm how impossible my situation had become. The program had promised traditional folk music performed with cultural authenticity, claims that would require extensive knowledge of Mexican musical history, regional variations, and appropriate presentation protocols that I'd never studied. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly recognizing that the community interest she'd generated was creating pressure rather than simple enthusiasm. "Well, they want to know which region of Mexico your family's musical traditions come from, what instruments you'll be using, and whether you'll be performing in Spanish or English." Some of them offered to help with pronunciation or provide traditional costumes if needed. Each question revealed another aspect of cultural expertise I didn't possess. My mother had sung Mexican lullabies when I was small, teaching me fragments of songs she'd learned from her own grandmother. But we'd never discussed regional traditions, historical context, or formal musical structures. Patricia's biographical claims had committed me to representing cultural knowledge that required years of study and family transmission I'd never experienced. The costume offer was particularly problematic because it suggested that community members expected visual authenticity to accompany the musical claims being made on my behalf. Traditional Mexican performance costumes carried cultural significance that extended far beyond decoration, requiring understanding of historical context and appropriate usage that I'd never learned. Wearing borrowed traditional clothing would add another layer of potential cultural insensitivity to an already problematic situation. Patricia, I think we need to contact Jessica and explain that there's been a misunderstanding about my background and capabilities. My voice was steadier than I'd expected, perhaps because the situation had become so obviously unsustainable that denial was no longer possible. I don't have the cultural knowledge or musical training to meet the expectations that have been created. It would be better to withdraw now than to disappoint people who are genuinely interested in authentic cultural sharing. Her response was immediate and defensive, suggesting that she'd been anticipating this conversation and had prepared arguments to maintain the commitment she'd made. Emma, you're letting anxiety override your common sense. Of course you have cultural knowledge. It's part of your family heritage. You don't need formal academic training to share songs and traditions that are naturally yours. The argument revealed Patricia's fundamental misunderstanding of cultural representation and authenticity. She seemed to believe that ethnic identity automatically conferred musical expertise, regardless of personal experience, family transmission, or individual preparation. Her logic would make every person of Mexican heritage qualified to represent traditional folk music, ignoring the reality that cultural knowledge required active learning and community participation rather than genetic inheritance. But beyond the cultural representation issues, the practical demands of the enhanced performance were becoming impossible to manage. The collaboration with Monica Park would require coordination that couldn't be achieved in the remaining time, especially given my teaching responsibilities and Monica's college schedule. The extended performance slot demanded repertoire I didn't possess and stamina I'd never developed through regular practice. Patricia, even if we set aside the cultural authenticity questions, I don't have enough prepared material for a 20-minute performance slot. The logistics were overwhelming even without considering the misrepresented expertise claims. I was planning to sing one song, probably something my mother taught me when I was young. That's not sufficient content for the kind of extended performance you've committed me to. She leaned forward with the expression she used when preparing to share what she considered helpful problem-solving advice. Well, that's exactly why the collaboration with Monica will be so beneficial. She can provide instrumental music between your vocal pieces, maybe some traditional Mexican guitar music that will enhance the cultural authenticity of the overall presentation. Her suggestion revealed how completely she'd missed the point of my objections. Patricia was treating the performance like a variety show where different elements could be combined arbitrarily to fill time requirements, ignoring the artistic and cultural coherence that would be necessary for authentic presentation. She was asking Monica to provide generic Mexican guitar music to accompany my amateur vocals, creating a pastiche of cultural elements that would satisfy neither artistic nor authenticity standards. The afternoon brought additional phone calls and messages that confirmed how extensively the enhanced performance plans had been communicated throughout the community. Linda Park called to discuss coordination between Monica and me, assuming that we were both enthusiastic about the collaboration and simply needed logistical support to make it successful. Her tone carried the excitement of someone who believed she was facilitating a wonderful artistic partnership. Emma, Monica is so looking forward to working with you. Linda's voice bubbled with maternal pride in her daughter's musical abilities and apparent confidence in my complementary skills. She's been practicing traditional Mexican guitar pieces all semester in her world music class, so she'll have plenty of material to share with you. The revelation that Monica had been studying Mexican guitar music in an academic context only emphasized how underqualified I was for the cultural representation being expected. She would bring formal training, academic knowledge, and appropriate repertoire to our collaboration, while I would contribute amateur vocals and fabricated expertise that couldn't withstand scrutiny from anyone with actual cultural background. But Linda's enthusiasm had already advanced beyond the planning stage to specific performance details that Patricia had apparently approved without consulting me. We thought you could open with a traditional welcome song, maybe something like Las Mañanitas that everyone would recognize, then move into some regional folk pieces that showcase your family's musical heritage. The song suggestions revealed how thoroughly Patricia had committed me to specific cultural claims that I couldn't support. Las Mañanitas was indeed a traditional Mexican song, but performing it would require understanding of its cultural significance, appropriate vocal, styling, and historical context that I'd never studied. Linda was expecting authentic cultural presentation based on biographical claims that existed only in Patricia's promotional materials. That evening, David came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by printed programs, cultural, music research I'd desperately begun attempting, and pages of notes about Mexican folk song traditions that I was trying to absorb in preparation for a performance that seemed increasingly impossible. His immediate concern was visible as he absorbed the evidence of crisis that had expanded significantly since our previous conversation about the talent showcase. "Honey, this looks like you're cramming for a final exam in a subject you've never studied." David's observation was more accurate than he probably realized, given that I was essentially trying to acquire cultural and musical expertise that typically required years of family transmission or formal academic study. What's happened since yesterday that's made this situation so much more intense? His question provided an opening to explain how Patricia's initial manipulation had evolved into a community-wide commitment that extended far beyond anything I could realistically fulfill. The enhanced performance expectations, the cultural representation claims, and the collaboration with Monica had combined to create a situation that would require either miraculous transformation or public humiliation. "David, your mother has agreed to commitments on my behalf that I can't meet." I tried to keep my voice calm despite the overwhelming anxiety that had been building throughout the day. "I'm now expected to perform traditional Mexican folk music for 20 minutes, collaborate with Monica Park, who has formal training I lack, and represent cultural authenticity that I don't possess. The situation has moved far beyond what I can manage." His expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm as he processed the scope of what I was describing. David had grown up watching Patricia's community involvement, but he'd never been directly affected by her tendency to make commitments for other people without consulting them first. The talent showcase crisis was his first experience with the potential consequences of his mother's well-intentioned but controlling management style. "Mom, what exactly did you agree to?" David's question was directed toward Patricia with a tone that carried more authority than he typically used when addressing his mother's community activities. His medical training had taught him to assess crisis situations quickly and intervene before they escalated beyond manageable limits, and he was apparently recognizing that the talent showcase situation required immediate attention. Patricia's response maintained the defensive optimism she'd been using throughout the evolving crisis, but her confidence was clearly strained by the growing evidence that her management of my participation had created more problems than opportunities. "David, I simply responded to requests from the organizing committee for enhanced cultural programming. Emma has wonderful abilities that deserve to be showcased properly." Her explanation reframed reactive decision-making as proactive cultural programming, suggesting that she'd been responding to community needs rather than creating unrealistic expectations through promotional exaggeration. But David's medical background had trained him to recognize when explanations didn't match observable evidence, and his expression indicated skepticism about his mother's version of events. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Patricia maintaining that the enhanced performance commitments were manageable with proper preparation, David expressing increasing concern about the psychological pressure I was experiencing, and me trying to explain how the cultural representation claims had created expectations that extended far beyond musical performance into areas of expertise I'd never developed. But the most devastating realization was that Patricia's manipulation had evolved beyond simple boundary violation into a kind of fraud that would damage relationships with community members who had legitimate interests in cultural authenticity and artistic excellence. The biographical fabrications weren't just personally embarrassing. They were professionally and culturally problematic in ways that could affect my standing as an educator and community member long after the talent showcase ended. Monica called that night to discuss our collaboration, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of a trained musician excited about the opportunity to perform traditional Mexican music with someone she'd been told shared her cultural and artistic interests. The conversation was devastating because her genuine excitement about authentic cultural sharing only emphasized how completely Patricia's fabrications had misrepresented my background and capabilities. Emma, I'm so excited to work with you on this performance. Monica's voice bubbled with the energy of someone who believed she'd found a kindred spirit in cultural music preservation. My world music professor says that authentic intergenerational transmission of folk traditions is becoming increasingly rare, so having the opportunity to collaborate with someone who learned directly from family sources is really special. Her words cut deeply because they revealed how thoroughly Patricia's biographical claims had created expectations for cultural knowledge and family musical transmission that existed only in the program's fictional narrative. Monica was expecting to learn from me about traditional practices I'd never experienced, family musical knowledge I'd never acquired, and cultural authenticity I couldn't provide. The phone call continued for nearly an hour, with Monica sharing her academic research about regional Mexican musical styles, discussing appropriate instrumentation for traditional folk songs, and asking detailed questions about my family's specific cultural practices that I couldn't answer without revealing the complete fabrication of my biographical background. Each question made the impossibility of the collaboration more obvious, while highlighting the depth of deception that would be required to maintain Patricia's promotional claims. By the time I hung up the phone, the full scope of Patricia's manipulation had become clear. She hadn't simply signed me up for a community talent show performance. She'd committed me to cultural representation, musical collaboration, and artistic presentation that would require expertise I didn't possess, cultural knowledge I'd never acquired, and performance skills I'd never developed. The talent showcase had become a trap baited with good intentions but designed with complete disregard for my actual capabilities or comfort level. The realization that withdrawal from the performance would now disappoint multiple community members who had been led to expect authentic cultural sharing and professional-level musical collaboration made the situation feel hopeless. Patricia's well-intentioned enhancement of my participation had created a web of expectations and commitments that couldn't be fulfilled without significant community disappointment or maintained without perpetuating fraudulent claims about my background and abilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.